It seems to me that 9/11 was a kind of a wake-up call for a lot of people. The United States is a very insular society. Most people don't pay much attention to what goes on outside, and in fact, people don't know much about the outside world. They don't geography, history, it's all something out there. But the impact of September 11th, part of the impact, I think, was to make people feel we better find out something about the world and our role in it and the way people feel and so on. And there was a notable increase, very great increase in requests for talks and sales of books. All the small publishers started republishing books that had been out of print for years, but just because the demand grew so much. I mean, I know myself, the request for talks and discussions just skyrocketed after 9/11, and everyone else who's publicly available had the same experience. I think that was a very healthy reaction. There were also unhealthy reactions of the kind that you mentioned. They're there too. Life's a complicated affair. But some of the reactions were healthy, sensible, and an opportunity to build on. I think a lot of the massive protest against the Iraq War, which was unprecedented, is based on that. As to the hijacking of voices, well, people can do what they want. It's up to each individual, you, everyone else, to decide what makes sense and what doesn't make sense.
North Widmer, New York. Go ahead, please.
Hello, Dr. Chomsky. I'd like to ask you regarding your history with Zionism. Do you see a difference between a Jewish homeland and a Jewish state?
Yeah. So, one could debate the validity of having a Jewish homeland in Palestine. That's the question, but let's accept that for the moment. The part of the Zionist movement that I belong to, and my parents as well, I should say, back in the 30s and the 40s, was committed to establishing a kind of Jewish homeland in Palestine. It's debatable, but yeah, that was my position then and still is. A Jewish state is a different matter. That's a state which, in fact, the groups that I was part of were calling for binational settlement in Palestine, a binational Palestine, Jewish and Arab, and with a democratic society based on, it was a socialist movement, so based on there was a big cooperative movement, collectives and so on, efforts to integrate the general populations into it. How realistic that was, or even how valid, one can debate, but it's quite different than the notion of a Jewish state. Once the state was established in 1948, a lot of these questions became moot. And as I said before, I think the state itself should have whatever rights any state can legitimately claim. And as I mentioned, I don't think states can claim many rights, but maybe any. But whatever they have in the international system, this is one of them. But to be a Jewish state or an Islamic state or a Christian state or a white state, that's a different matter.
Madison, Wisconsin. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I wanted to follow up on a comment that Professor Chomsky made with regard to trade agreements. From what I understand, foreign corporations have even more rights in the United States than American corporations do, because the foreign corporations are entitled to sue the U.S. government for financial losses supposedly caused by American laws, say, governing discrimination in the workplace or the environment.
Well, that's not just foreign corporations. I mean, the trade laws do grant corporations rights that human beings don't have. Included among them are measures. It's a complicated matter, but there are measures which in effect allow corporations to sue governments for alleged loss of profits and so on. And some such suits have been carried out by U.S. corporations, incidentally, against Mexico, against Canada, and in principle other corporations in other countries could do that here too. These, in my view, are completely illegitimate. You can't sue Mexico, I can't sue Mexico, but a Metalclad Corporation was able to sue Mexico because they claimed that environmental laws passed by a Mexican province interfered with their right to put, I think it was a waste disposal dump there or something, and they actually won under NAFTA rules. But that's mutual. That's not just foreign corporations.
Eureka, California.
Yes, Professor Chomsky, I have three quick questions for you. They're simple to answer. Other than voting, what can a person do? Is one thing I'd like to know about the current situation. The other thing is, other than the Constitution, what document or one book would you suggest a person read? And third, are you ever going to get your own talk show on radio?
Well, to answer the last one, no, I'm never going to have my own talk show. I couldn't handle it, and I'd never get it anyway. On the second question, I really can't mention one book that people should read. It depends on your own interests and concerns. I'm asked a lot to give people, reading lists, but until, the only people who can decide what they ought to read are the people themselves. They know their interests, they know their concerns, they know their degree of commitment. I mean, if you ask a question, what should you read about this and that topic, I may have a suggestion. But what book should you read, I can't say. You want to know something about the history of the United States, one book I'd suggest is a book by an old close friend who was on this program just a year ago, Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States, which I think has just sold its millionth copy, is a terrific introduction to the history of the United States in a way in which it is not usually taught but should be. So that's one suggestion. As far as voting's concerned, voting is a fine thing. I'm glad we have the right to vote. But you have to have somebody to vote for. There have to be issues and candidates and what are called sometimes secondary associations. That means organizations of people who press their own interests and concerns. Then voting can become meaningful. So let's say take the primary system in the United States and just ask how it works. Say New Hampshire primaries. What happens is candidates come to town and they say, here's what I stand for, vote for me, and then they go somewhere else. The people who are listening to them probably don't believe what they're saying and have no special reason to. But that's not the way a democracy ought to function. The way a democracy ought to function is the people in the town should say, get together, discuss, work out what they think ought to happen in the country. And then they should invite people, either they elect their own candidate, pick their own candidates, which is the best way, or if others are running for office, say, okay, come here, and we'll tell you what we think you ought to do if you're elected. If you don't want to do that, then go away. This is what we want. That would be democratic, more democratic. But until things like that happen on a very large scale, there isn't going to be a functioning democracy.
Do you vote?
Do I? I tend to vote for local candidates, and as it goes up the scale, I tend to vote less and less because I think they're less and less responsive to the population and less and less and more responsive to external forces. However, it varies, and it's really a particular choice, case by case.
El Paso, go ahead.
Yes, Dr. Chomsky, I've been a fan of yours for many years, and regarding the last caller's questions, books that should be read, I've read a couple of interest to myself lately that I'd like to hear your comments on. One of them is Ann Coulter's book called Slander, which talks a lot about the liberal media, and I'd like to ask you what you think we in the public can do to get the media, the mainstream media, to respond and give more conservative views and more international views than we're currently being fed by the newspapers and the mainstream media broadcast. My second question has to do with the book by Joan Peters, From Time Immemorial. And I find that a very well-researched book, and I was appalled to learn of the British involvement in the state of affairs that exists now in Israel, And I was also appalled to learn of the delusions that have been passed down for apparently centuries regarding the history between the Israelis and the Arabs in what you call, the Jewish homeland.
Thanks, caller.
Okay, well, the Joan Peters book, I'm sorry to say, is a hoax, which was exposed and was withdrawn from publication after exposure. And it's now come back, I'm surprised to see. When the book first came, it looks well researched on the surface.
What's the point?
The book claims that the Palestinians are recent immigrants who came in after the Jewish settlement, and therefore they can sort of go home, and there's no moral issue. It has a lot of footnotes and what look like a lot of sources. It was immediately analyzed very carefully. The best work on it was done by Norman Finkelstein. You can read a detailed analysis of it in his excellent book, Image and Reality in the Israel-Palestine conflict. But he exposed it very quickly. It was also exposed in Israel by some of the leading scholars who pointed out this nonsense. The book had a wonderful reception in the United States. The publishers then made an editorial error and allowed it to appear in England. As soon as it appeared in England, it was demolished by scholars, by journalists, by everyone. It was then kind of withdrawn here. People withdrew their support for it, and it disappeared. I'd suggest you look very carefully at the critical discussion of it before relying on what it says. As for Ann Coulter, I didn't read her book, but talk about the liberal media. It just doesn't make any sense. I mean, for one thing, the media have if you want to say the media are liberal, I can't disagree. I mean, so the journalists tend to support women's choice. Yeah, probably. Do they believe in civil rights? Yeah, probably. But that has almost nothing to do with the content of the media. If you want to, I've written a lot about the media, but I've never talked about liberal conservative bias because I don't think it means anything. You want to understand the media, first of all, take a look at their content. Okay, I gave one example before, the propaganda, fantastic propaganda, which managed to convince people of these credible delusions about Iraq. It's not that the media came out and said Saddam Hussein was responsible for 9/11, but they permitted distribution of those charges uncritically in such a way that the population actually came to believe it. And there's case after case of this. Before this, earlier in the program, I mentioned that you can't find a map in the media of the Clinton-Barack offers of a settlement in Camp David, which was so highly praised. Well, I don't know if that's liberal bias or conservative bias, but it's not a journalistic integrity. If you want people to understand what this proposal was, show them a map. That's the way to decide what it was. And that was withheld. And there's case after case of this. I think there's enormous documentation of the fact, you can check it if you like, that the choice of topics, the shaping of information, the basic assumptions and so on fall within a fairly narrow spectrum, which tend to be highly supportive of state and corporate power. I don't think it's either liberal or conservative. It's just the way things work. Some of my favorite newspapers are called very conservative, like the news reporting in the Wall Street Journal is as good as any I know, maybe better. And it's supposed to be a conservative journal. But the question is, what is the media product? And then, if you want to understand it, you don't look at liberal and conservative, whatever they mean. You look at the institutional roots. What kind of institutions are the media? Well, turns out they're major corporations tied in with even bigger ones. Their income comes from other businesses, namely advertisers. They're basically selling a product, namely audiences, to other businesses. And I think if you look, you find that the interests and concerns of the sellers and the buyers have a very powerful influence on the media product. That has to be demonstrated, not just asserted. But that's my opinion, and as I say, I and others have written a lot about it, but I don't think it has anything to do with liberal and conservative bias.
About 30 minutes left with Noam Chomsky. Trumansburg, New York. Go ahead, please.
Yes, Dr. Chomsky.